I feel really stupid because there's so many things to take note of that I take it, like you basically take for granted when you write JavaScript. And then when you write Rust, you're like, why doesn't this work? And you're like, oh, because it's an unsigned int and like it overflows in this particular case and you need to account for that. Yeah. Yeah. But it's been good. I've enjoyed it.
I've only very briefly played around with Rust, and feeling stupid definitely maps to my experience as well.
Yeah, it's like you could do it for 2 months and just like still feel like you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's tough. I wrote some Rust code to parse a Terraria world file, right, and extract a image from it. And yeah, it took a while. There's definitely a learning curve. Like Rust is probably the strictest language I've ever used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
very different than using JavaScript. There's some really good things about what it does. Like I like how it handles errors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah,
it looks like, I mean, just from the mostly outside, but it looks like possibly the best systems programming language we've developed, like the world has developed to date. Like
I would say that's true. Yeah, and the error messages honestly helped me so much. Like the compiler helped me with so many errors many times, and they tell you exactly what to do. They're like, this thing needs to be a mutable reference, maybe make it mutable, and I'm like, cool.
The thing that I can't wrap my head around is lifetimes.
I have not figured out lifetimes either, and it's the way around it is I essentially create a variable that copies a specific thing I need to use, so I don't have to use lifetimes, just because I still don't understand lifetimes.
Mm-hmm. The syntax is really kind of, yeah, I don't know. The syntax is not helpful to me for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think even like the Rust book, like reading that part is not easy. Because they're like, oh, if you read the book, you'll understand everything about Rust. And I'm like, the book explains it, but it's very confusing. It's not until you like actually implement it like 10 times that you understand it.
all right, shall we turn on recording and start moving that direction? Let's see, where's my record? Hello. Okay, that looks like it's doing all right.
I am recording the Zoom right now. I haven't gone live on audio yet, though.
Okay.
Oh, I need to start my recording. I'm not going to have anything to say during the first segment, probably. Just FYI.
Kind of same. I'm hoping to ask some good questions to Divya.
Yay. I think, yeah, we will have a bunch of things to talk about there. So
I was scanning through the links that we were posting, and then I realized one of them refers to an article I wrote, and so I was like, "Whoa, I wrote it."
Really?
What feels like a decade ago, because it was before shelter in place, but there was like a thing about the controversy of the of the functional API.
Yes. Okay. I still haven't read Evan's giant increment post. But that's linked up here. I think I sort of like, without reading it, he's talked about a lot of these things before, so.
Yeah, I was scanning it just now. I mean, some of the, I think for this conversation, just the high level outcomes, pretty dropping the bundle size, dropping the amount of CPU usage by 10x, things like that. Like those seem like pretty good things to highlight.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, I've been using Vue and TypeScript for a project. It's so painful.
Vue 2?
Vue 2, yeah.
Yeah. Vue 3 should be so much better for that.
I think the class-based syntax is still going to be around, though. Like, because I asked Evan about it. I was like, so if you write TypeScript Vue, will you still use classes? And he's like, yeah, I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to write strict TypeScript, because you can write regular view without making it explicitly TypeScript, and it checks it. But if you wanted to be more strict about TypeScript, then you would use class-based syntax, which is weird. I've been using class-based syntax and struggling. Especially with like imported libraries. I'm using like Monaco, the VS Code editor. And I had to import the types because it didn't automatically know. And yeah, it's a pain.
Monaco is fun. I've played with that.
Yeah, it's really nice because then you don't have to like create an editor yourself. You get all the niceties of it. I'm just creating like a very basic playground type of an editor using Monaco for some Netlify stuff. And I don't know if it's too busy, like if I'm doing too much, because Monaco does a lot. I'm like, maybe if I just did a much simpler editor, I might not need it. But
I'm going to turn on the live broadcast if everyone's cool with that.
yeah.
Go for it.
Hello, live listeners. Check.
Do we have any live listeners? Chime in the party channel.
There it is. So, do these segments look good?
I think so. Is section 2 it's just anything today I learned?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
You mean like, does it have to be tech focused or?
No, just like, does it have to be JavaScript focused?
Oh yeah. Mine is kind of, but no, it doesn't have to be, I don't think.
The only things I've learned recently have been regarding Minecraft. So
nice.
I don't have anything.
You should share that.
Can't
you should share it.
Can't you do scripting in Minecraft?
Yeah.
Oh
sort of.
yeah. The mod scene for Minecraft is out of control. It's but it's all Java, so I have no interest. No interest. They do have, you can write one in Kotlin, but I have no interest in that either. So.
Can you do it in any JVM language?
Theoretically, I mean it runs in JVM, so you could probably create some sort of bridge for any JVM language. So I mean, you could probably figure out how to use Jython. You know,
I was thinking Jython or JRuby.
Right.
I was going to say that there are like Python APIs for it, I think, or ways to write plugins in Python.
Because some of these languages, particularly Ruby, bring me joy to work in. Some of these languages, Java, are very painful.
Yeah. But Ruby, I don't know. I was just talking to coworkers about this. Like, Ruby's okay with you monkey patching everything everywhere. I just can't believe that is that people can be productive in an environment where you have no idea what the environment is.
I mean, can't you do that in JavaScript?
Oh yeah, but it's heavily frowned upon and not taught as like the way to go. Whereas like when I was doing a Rails app, I couldn't tell where Ruby ended and Rails began. And the way that I got around that was I shouldn't care because I'll never be out of this environment.
That's sort of true, right? So like the way I think of Ruby is it is the best language out there for writing DSLs.
Yeah.
So use it that way, right? Create a DSL for your application approach. So I mean, thinking about modding Minecraft, right? You could make a Minecraft specific DSL based on Ruby and it would probably be phenomenal. And Rails is a DSL for building web apps. That's all it is.
Yeah. I wasn't in that frame of mind, for sure.
I didn't say it was my favorite language for building enterprise applications. I said it was the one that brings me joy to play with.
Sure.
Nick, there was a tweet that you made, I don't know, a week ago, something about Git Config. I thought it was you.
That sounds like something I'd tweet about.
I don't know. I remember I was interested in, it was some sort of hack around Git config stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That could be in your Today I Learned.
Yeah, I was going to copy it.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, for sure. That is super. I love that I found that, but it is so much like, it's a crazy hack, I guess. Is the way
you have that tweet handy?
Almost. I'm scrolling through my not very long timeline.
All right, and then let's maybe get rolling. I don't have a tight time limit, but I do not have.
Okay, here it is. Okay, this was back in May. So I found it.
Okay, yeah. We can get started then. And we'll just kind of jump right in to talking about Vue. Okay. Oh, real quick. Can you hear this?
What?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. All right. I will get started with the music then. Here we go.
Yay.
Hello and welcome to another exciting JS party. I'm your host this week, Nick, and I am joined by three fantastic panelists. First off, KBall. How's it going, KBall?
Hello.
Welcome. And also Divya. Divya, welcome.
Hello.
And finally, last but definitely not least, is Chris, or AKA Bone Skull. Bone Skull, how's it going?
Howdy.
We have an exciting show lined up for you today. We are going to be talking, first off, about the framework wars, and specifically, what is new in Vue? What is coming down the pipeline apparently soonish with Vue 3? And our resident Vue expert, Divya, is going to walk us through that. Divya, do you want to tell us some of the exciting things coming in Vue 3?
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a lot, I think, in previous episodes. KBall and I have gabbed on and on about Vue 3 and we've speculated many times as to when Vue 3 will appear and come to the fore without knowing exactly when that date is. But I think it was the beginning of this month, so July 1st, Avenue opened an issue in the RFC's repo for Vue with the status update, which is something that we've been waiting for a really long time. Because I think Vue 3 was slated to be released at the end of 2019, and then they were like beginning 2020. I think eventually it was around Q2, so we are in sort of Q2. Are we Q2? Yeah. And so there's finally an actual status update. It's not super clear as to the exact date that the release will happen, but there is like a long thread as to that points to the targets that they have at the moment, which is actually the closest that they've ever gone to telling you a timeline. And so from that particular doc, which we'll copy in the notes, it says that IE11 compatibility will be by July 2020. I would say end of July because we're currently at the beginning of July. We haven't heard anything yet. So July 2020, I think, is IE11 compatibility as well as the migration guide, which I think is going to be really important for people to migrate their applications. But in terms of using Vue 3, I believe it's fairly production ready at the moment. And by production ready, I mean it's ready if you don't care about IE11. Otherwise, it's not production ready. but it is ready to be used. I think they've compartmentalized various parts of Vue 3, so you can use the composition API, you can use Vue Router in the Vue 3 form, and so on. And so you can pick and choose and use various parts of Vue 3 and the updated release without having to wait for a lot of these pieces if you don't care about that. So that's actually really exciting. I think the final release date, when they're like everything will be cut and dried done, is August. According to this document, it says early August is when final release will happen, when you can sort of say it's actually fully ready. But yeah, actually that's super soon. So that's like, in a month or two, we'll have Vue 3 finally here. That's fingers crossed that this deadline does not extend further. But I would say that that's the most exciting thing, I think. And alongside that way, I think you might have seen, but Evan Yu has also been talking a lot about various experiments he's been doing with Vue. So Vite is, I think we've talked about it in a previous episode, was something that he just released one day, which I assume was just like, while working on Vue 3, decided to do something else using like dog fooding, essentially, Vue 3 and modern experimental standards like ESM and so on. I think it uses Snowpack. So that's also a really cool thing that came out of the overall like development and dog fooding of Vue 3. So there's so much that's happening in that space. I think in the next 2 months, you'll see a lot of like exciting developments and probably a bunch of blog posts and comments and tweets.
Very cool. Yeah, August is, depending on how you view time right now, it's an eternity away or it's tomorrow. It's
exactly.
Our time is so bizarre right now. Well, and thinking about it, I know Evan Yu has at least one kid, and I don't know how many other folks working on the Vue 3 release also have kids, but I feel like we can give them a little slack on shipping late, at least given mine and every other parent's experience over the last few months.
Shipping anything right now really feels like an accomplishment. So yeah.
Whew. Yeah.
But just to kind of touch a little bit on the history of Vue 3, because we've definitely talked about it before. And surprise, surprise, one of the things that I specifically remember about it is that it's being rewritten in TypeScript. I don't know why that part would stick in my head, but it did. And I know also, didn't it start off as kind of a private repo that just the core team was kind of working on in secret for a while to kind of get their ideas flushed out? And then obviously it's been opened up since then. Is that right?
Yes. So one thing that was pretty interesting is the development process for Vue 3 happened right about at the same time as the Vue team also started really using an RFC process, request for comments process. So they kept the core development experiments early in Vue 3 as a private repo, but they were broadcasting a lot of the proposals for features in public and working out through those in public, which to me was a really interesting balance of let's not have the experience where we have something super raw and unready and we get 20 million issues and pull requests from people who don't understand what we're doing, but let's also have this process be open so folks can actually get their opinions in and it's not just happening in secret.
Yeah. I imagine that that's where the prologue version of Vue died.
Potentially.
Oh, Nick, I've missed you.
I really like the RFC process because I think it was also a really good way for the community to feel heard, because for the longest time there was this concept that Vue had, like, Evan Yu is the BDFL of Vue and he held the reins, and there was always speculation as to what would happen if a bus hit Evan or a dinosaur ate him or something, and he no longer could be part of the project. And so the RFC was also in line with making sure that the community there was transparency so people knew what was being worked on. And I think it was also the beginning of the core team and various members of the core team taking more responsibility for core, because a lot of them were they owned various parts of the ecosystem like the router and Vuex and so on. But I think core was a lot of it Evan's responsibility. And so I think with the release of an RFC process and more transparency, the various members of the core team started being more involved with core. And I think Evan wanted that as well. And he's talked about wanting that and making sure that everyone is part of that so that he could slowly, cede responsibility to people. And I think that's really cool because it also shows the community aspect of Vue, because we've talked about this before, that the success of a framework has to do with the people who use it as well. And I think sometimes people forget that because they're like, my framework uses X technology and it's awesome. And it doesn't matter who uses it. It's just like this technology speaks for itself and people will use it because of how great it is. But I think that is a misnomer. And Vue has shown through its actions and through all these processes that they have in place that they care about the people who use it a lot and they actually listen. So the RFC process is not just like a shell where they're like, oh, let's pretend we listen to people and then close the issue and never listen to them. But I've actually seen like Evan taking a lot of the RFCs into consideration and actually changing APIs as a result. So that's actually really great to see that.
Yeah, there was a pretty dramatic shift in how what became the composition API shook out. The composition API started out as the functional API proposal, which was the hooks inspired change to Vue that I'm probably the most excited of anything in Vue 3 about that and some of the stuff that enables. But the first version of that got a lot of blowback, and it was super impressive to me to watch that process play out. And that's challenging community management. How do you nudge people towards change while also accepting legitimate criticisms and using that to make the final outcome better? But I think Evan and the whole team there did a great job.
Yeah, it's always hard because I think everyone's a critic, right? And not a lot of people are doing the work and everyone's just quick to criticize. And so it's also easy to get really defensive. And I've seen frameworks do that, where the moment someone raises an issue, they get automatically defensive and they double down on a decision they've made. And within Vue, there was sort of this like criticism that came up in the beginning, because with the functional API in particular, that was actually really controversial, because when it was released, they talked about, and this was, I think, April or May of last year when they released the functional API RFC, and it alluded to the possibility of the functional API being a new syntax and not being backward compatible. So Vue 3 would just move away from current Vue 2 syntax and move into this territory and like not actually support Vue 2 at all. And I think there was a collective frustration by everyone. And I think that was a moment in Vue's history. I think like the most controversial thing probably happened that in Vue's history, where they were like, oh, this is a mistake we've made and we need to figure out how to be better. And I think I've seen a lot of progress from that point on. So that's actually like, yeah, if anything, it's made me want to use Vue more, because I'm like, this is great.
Well, then contrast it to the Angular debacle of several years back. That's having the community engagement in the RFC process gets you, is you see how big of a debacle it's going to be before it's written in code and released, and you're able to head that off at the pass.
You're talking about like Angular 2/4, that whole area?
Yeah, so Angular 1 to Angular 2, there was no migration path, there was no anything. It's still a confusion to this day. There's disaster. I mean, it reminds me of the Python 2.3 debacle as well, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you don't think about how you're going to migrate people off of these things, or how you're going to maintain backwards compatibility, one or the other, you got to pick one, then you end up in this bifurcated world where you're supporting both, and it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I think React does the same thing as well. They have quite a transparent RFC process. I don't know the internals of the decision-making process as well, because they're a bit unique because a company is tied to the framework. It's not completely community-driven, but I do see at least the intention is there with the RFC process. But of course, slightly different because they do have company goals to meet as well there.
So yeah, that's awesome hearing that they're doing community management really well. That's something that is very easy to mess up and very hard to get right. And it seems like the RFC process is a really good way to not just take that community feedback, but also, as you've pointed out, they are learning from that and integrating community feedback into creating a Vue that everyone wants to use, which is really great. So on that, what are some of the big changes between Vue 2 and Vue 3? Is there anything majorly drastic?
Well, as a user, you might be excited to hear, drops in average size from, 20 or 30 kilobytes minified to 10-ish. Drops in CPU usage. I heard an estimate that Evan put out of it cuts it by a factor of 10. So you're 10x less CPU usage in normal use. And probably the most exciting thing to me as somebody who loves to just like geek out on stuff is that they're exposing the reactivity API through this composition API so that you can not just use it within Vue blessed constructs, but really build structures around it, build your own compositions based on reactivity. And I think, honestly, the web world, and especially the front end world, is moving to reactivity-based approaches and mental models and thinking across the board. And I'm super excited to see that being exposed as a raw primitive and rather than having it just something that magically happens as a part of the framework.
Yeah, I think that one's a big one in terms of user land changes, because a lot of it is performance changes and the way they do tree shaking has changed, the bundle size has changed. I think the biggest differences in terms of what users will notice from using or writing Vue is like first class type support. And then also, as KBall said, the composition API is a really big one because that's actually still divisive in the community. You still, even though there was an RFC process and it was heavily talked about online, on Twitter, on GitHub, and various other places, you still hear people getting really like upset about it or really excited about it. It's very divisive because of how different it is with using Vue 2 currently. And that's mainly because it, as KBall mentioned, it's this like encapsulating the reactivity system of Vue, so you could just use like functions rather than Vue components. And so the Vue or the components are basically moved out or isolated from the functionality, which makes reusability a bit easier. To some people, it's a bit more complicated. I would argue it's easier, but I've drank the Kool-Aid, so I'm all for that. But yeah, it's just really interesting, and I think it'll be neat to see what kind of patterns emerge from this. Because from my understanding with the composition API, there isn't really like a proper pattern as to how to write it. So for example, the way I've been using the composition API is I create a functions folder in my source folder, and then I write the functions. And so it's very different because with regular patterns in Vue, if you have components, it's in a components folder, and there's a sort of a tried and true pattern for how you would use them across an application. And I think with the composition API, they've yet to emerge patterns because it's not widely adopted enough for that. So it'll be interesting to see what kinds of things emerge.
Yeah, I feel like the hooks ecosystem around React took a solid 6 to 9 months to really develop into good patterns, libraries, established best practices, and all of that. And I expect we'll see a similar thing once Vue 3 actually ships.
Yeah, so are those composition functions, do they kind of parallel hooks? I don't actually know much about Vue.
They are hooks inspired, but not hooks exactly equivalent.
Sure.
I honestly, my impression of them is they feel more naturally continuous from the way that Vue felt before, whereas hooks was a big mental shift in how React functioned. But that's a personal opinion. I know there are folks who disagree and say, no, this is too big of a change. This is following on, and it's really complicated.
Very cool. Well, yeah, that looks like something that is going to be very exciting to play around with in just a few short years or tomorrow, depending on how you're looking at it. So we'll look forward to talking more about Vue 3 as it comes out. All right. And we'll stop there for our first break. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover on Vue?
I think we covered a lot. I almost feel like I talk about it so much. I've covered all. I think between KBall and I, we've covered like most territory.
I miss working in Vue, honestly. I'm like all React world on the front end now. And there's stuff I like about it, but I miss Vue.
Yeah. I am currently working on like an isolated project where I got to choose the stack. It's essentially just like a little playground that I'm working on for Netlify. And yeah, I got to pick the front end framework. They were like, do whatever you want. And I was like, Vue. And then I threw in TypeScript because I was like, why not? I need a challenge, something different. Still questioning if that was a good decision.
I'm gonna go grab a snack real quick while we're on break.
Sure.
Okay. But it's really interesting. I still find it neat or fascinating how I'm understanding TypeScript by learning other languages, not by learning TypeScript. Because I've read all the resources for TypeScript and I'm like, it's still not mentally registering. And then when I was writing Go and when I wrote Rust, I was like, okay, I think I understand TypeScript now. It's weird.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's just a mental model shift. Like,
yeah.
You think about JavaScript in such a way that when something changes, it's hard to like shift. So you have to like go. It's almost like learning a different language to like understand grammar of the language you speak.
There was a book I read years ago. I think it was called like 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. And it was just like a whirlwind tour of 7 different languages to help you understand like how they approach solving the same problem.
Yeah.
And then you can use that to come back to whatever language you were learning or are learning and apply those rules. So that's a really cool way to come at learning about a language.
All right. I'm good now.
All right.
Are you in the office, KBall?
Yeah. So our office, everybody's work from home, but you can schedule time. They'll allow one person in the office at a time.
No way.
Yep. And since my wife is currently using my home office to do therapy at this time, I needed a place to podcast. And so I've been scheduling this last week and this week.
Nice.
But one bonus perk right now is there's still snacks in here. They're a little stale, but I got chocolate covered pretzels and they are amazing and delicious.
Those are great. So is there someone who like, would they come in and clean the place after your use, or what's the...
I don't know exactly what the thing is there. The big focus they have right now is not having multiple people in the office at the same time.
Okay.
I don't know how much space they're scheduling between or how exactly they're doing that.
Yeah, but it is cool to have because it's convenient, especially if you don't have a conducive workspace, to be able to like schedule time to go in when you're like, I need dedicated time to take a meeting or whatever. That's pretty cool. They're doing something really similar with my climbing gym. But,
I'm almost entirely able to work at home. In fact, this has been the only thing where I wanted to have reliable internet and a good spot to set up a mic, because like most of the time, both my wife and I can just co-work in the office when we have childcare, and then one of us is out when we don't. But it's just when she has therapy where it absolutely has to be private, that like, because she's a therapist part-time.
But one of the things that I was really the most bummed about when the pandemic started and we couldn't go anywhere was I'd built up over the last year a good gym routine, and then all of a sudden that's not a safe place to go. But now I pretty much have a full gym in my garage, so I'm pretty happy with that.
You don't ever need to go back to the gym.
Yeah. All right, should we get started on segment 2? Okay. And we are back. Now in this segment, we're going to talk about things that we've learned. I won't say today I've learned, because maybe I didn't learn that much by lunchtime today, but recently I have learned some cool things, and I'm sure the other panelists have as well. So let's share some cool things that we've learned recently. And to start us off, KBall, do you want to start?
Sure. So I have been doing a lot of work in React recently, contrast to our Vue episode early. and learning about different pieces and things of it. And I ran into a problem that I wasn't sure how to solve, and ended up learning something about contexts and how context works. So for those who aren't super familiar, contexts are a way to avoid the prop drilling problem, where you have some data that is shared through many, many layers of components. And so you can set up a context provider, which essentially says, here's some data that I'm going to, and possibly some functions, but here's some data that I'm going to make available. And then any one of the children below that context can access that data. And I had a situation where I was providing some functions, and I wanted them to have different defaults at different layers of the hierarchy. So I, for example, wanted a report to be able to insert additional context to provide a set of defaults for those functions. And I was trying to figure out, how do I do it? Do I pull that context and modify it or things like that? And what I learned is contexts are shadowable. They have a particular key for the provider that it is that you're going to do it. And you can load that context in one location and then provide a shadow of it that might be a changed version or a completely different implementation, but that is tied into that same context provider. And everything that's a child of you will get that new version. So I was able to have, in this case, it was a translation service, and I had a translation service with different defaults that I would take the original context, I would get any information that it had, I would add additional information and create a new version of the translation service and provide it to my children. And so that's what I learned, is how do you combine and override context? You do it by taking advantage of this shadowing approach.
That is awesome. Maybe I'm not following along fully, but does it make it easier, harder to test with that? Like being able to set those, or does it not really change that?
Good question. So I think it depends a little bit on what layers you're testing in. So what it does mean, well, actually, anytime you have context, what it means is that the component that you're testing is dependent not only on the props that are being passed in, but the context that is being provided. And so that's something that you have to take into account in your testing. And in this case, now you have two different ways that that context being provided could be set up. So potentially you would have to take that into account in your testing. But I think, it's still reasonably well decoupled, right? It's still like you have to test each of these providers that you're creating, and then you have to test that the underlying components can deal with the types of things that are being provided. But the API was still consistent, so that the component testing in this case didn't have to change. You called the same functions, you called them in the same way. And in fact, that's probably pretty important as a principle. You'd need to make the context that you're providing provide exactly the same API that it had previously. So component testing didn't change, and it was just essentially testing two different forms of the context provider.
Nice. All right. Divya, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can go next. Mine is not JavaScript because I haven't been writing as much JavaScript. Well, I have been. I've been writing Vue, but I know a lot about Vue that it's hard to be. Today I learned. I guess I can, yeah, whatever. I'll talk about Rust because that's something I've been writing, even though this is JS Party. Rust Party. So I've been writing a lot of Rust at work, and it's been a very steep hill, which is not contrary to popular belief. I think people know that already. And one of the things that I had to learn is this concept of references and copy traits. And it's this essentially this idea of like when you're using a particular thing, like for instance, if you have a parameter or a variable elsewhere and you want to use that particular variable, within Rust, essentially there's a concept called lifetimes. So if a thing is used here and then you want to use it again later, Rust essentially kills it or removes it from memory because it's sort of trying to be as memory safe as possible. And I might be wrong in explaining this completely, which shows that this is very confusing for me myself as I understand this. but you have to essentially get around it using lifetimes, and I don't understand lifetimes for the life of me. And so what I've been doing instead is sort of trying to understand how references work by cheating, by creating a variable. So it's no longer a reference, it's just like a completely new thing. So it's been interesting, just like sort of playing around with the various ways of how memory is managed within Rust, because I think in JavaScript, we don't think about that at all. Yeah, exactly. It's just automatically garbage collected for you and everything is done. And so you don't think about it. But when you think in a systems language like Rust, where memory and safety is really important, you have to start thinking about how exactly things are being used, how references work, how like what can be copied or cloned if you wanted to use the thing elsewhere in your code and so on. So yeah, this is like a today I'm continuing to learn rather than I learned.
So are you using the clone method and stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also the interesting thing. I didn't realize, and maybe this is very obvious, I didn't realize that strings aren't automatically copyable. Like you can't just copy a string, you have to clone it.
Which string?
Good question. The string from, like if you do, so not a reference string, like an actual string.
Capital S.
Capital string. S string. So
right.
if you do capital S string, : from, whatever the string is, that's what I mean. Mm-hmm. That string. That is not copyable. It doesn't have a copy trait, which is another thing that you have to learn in Rust. What is a trait? And so just understanding how exactly to use things that seem really easy to use within Rust. So that's been fun. It's been a fun rabbit hole to go down as I implement a single API endpoint. It takes way longer than like doing it in Node or something, but more. I think it's a very steep learning curve. It's very difficult to learn, but when you do figure it out, it's very satisfying. So yeah.
Oh yeah, every time like it actually compiles and right, it feels awesome because you beat the borrow checker.
Yeah.
And you win Rust because you actually got it to compile.
That sounds about the opposite of JavaScript, where you figure it out, you figure out how it works, and then you just sit there asking yourself, why?
I was going to say that once you beat the borrow checker, you're pretty confident it's actually going to work, which is kind of the opposite of JavaScript.
Fair. That is fair. Although there is some kinks with like JavaScript with TypeScript, because the compiler will yell at you for, like lately I've been frustrated with TypeScript because I was using the Monaco editor in one of my components and I didn't have the types for it. And so I just used any and then TypeScript yelled at me. They were like, do not use the any. And even if I tried to turn it, I ended up turning it off in my TS config, but I felt really bad because it felt like I wasn't really using TypeScript. I was cheating my way around it.
So after fighting with Rust, when you come back to TypeScript, is it like, oh, you're the like gentle abuser?
Honestly, yes, because the thing with learning Rust is it's so difficult. You don't know what you're doing. And then you come to TypeScript and you're like, oh, okay, this is easy, like whatever. Because you can also like cheat your way around the config. And versus in Rust, there's no cheating. You can't cheat. And in JavaScript, you can be like, just poke at it. Or like cover it up with a, and forget that it's there. Yeah. Type ignore, yeah.
Well, I will set aside this strongly worded email that I'm writing to you now, Divya, about any in TypeScript. And I'll tell you about something that I learned recently. And I was working on some code, specifically some tests in TypeScript for a server-side API. And I was using Apollo client, which is a way to make GraphQL calls, basically. But I wanted to mock that out in my tests because I don't want to actually make GraphQL calls in these specific tests that I was doing. And I'm sure there's a way to do it, but I was kind of going really fast and just using the jest.mock feature where I can give it, Apollo/client and then provide it with a factory function telling it what to actually return when I use anything inside of there, specifically the Apollo client constructor. And I swear every time I do this with just mocking, I have to just kind of throw code at the wall and figure out what actually works, because I can never remember exactly how to mock like a constructor to have it return like the argue or the methods that I want to have mocked, so I can check those and make sure that they're called and such. So I spend a lot of time doing that. But anyway, I got it working. And the way that I got it working was by in that factory function saying that anytime I'm requesting Apollo client, here's a function to call, and that function returns an object that has my mocks on it. And so it was just using specifically the function keyword. I couldn't use arrow functions because you can't instantiate arrow functions. You can't call them with new. And so I spent a little bit of time remembering that, or being kindly reminded of that by the tool, and then got it working and go to commit everything. And we have a pre-commit hook that runs and will run ESLint -- fix to fix any ESLint problems. And it decided that it didn't like my use of function, the function keyword in there. So it rewrote that to be not an arrow function, but the third function syntax, which is the shorthand when you have a function on an object where it's just the name, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and then open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and your function's in there. So it's just removing the function keyword, or so it would seem. But that one you also cannot instantiate as new. And I think that what was happening was because I wasn't actually using the this keyword in there, ESLint just assumed that it could rewrite that to be the shorthand syntax and everything would be okay. I pushed it up, and of course CI caught that all of my tests failed because it couldn't actually instantiate any of those. So I got very mad at ESLint for a couple of days. But then I ended up rewriting that to, instead of using an actual function, just use an anonymous class and have that as the value that I return for Apollo client instead. But that's the thing I learned, is there are several ways to write functions in JavaScript. And of course we know that the big differences in the different syntaxes is how they handle the context or the this keyword in there. But also the newer ones can't be instantiated with new. And so that is something that I begrudgingly learned this week.
Is there a use case for calling new on a method of some class's prototype?
I don't think so. Not that I can think of. Yeah. This is like very weird code, right? Because I'm trying to mock out something in a test. So it's not like production level code that would actually be running anywhere except for in tests. And it's kind of a hack from the beginning. That's how I feel whenever I'm writing using just.mock, but yeah. Cool. So Boneskull, what have you learned recently?
So the thing that I wanted to say that I thought was neat, and this actually is a thing that Nick taught me via a tweet on twitter.com. And I'm not sure how to speak the code here, but essentially it's something in your Git config. And so a Git config is kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like an ini file, right? It's kind of sort of toml-like, right? And so you have a header, which is in the square brackets, and that's include. And with the include thing, you can give it paths to other Git config files, essentially. And so you can have your root Git config in your home dir, and then in this include section, you can go and pull in other files, right? And so if you are like me and like Nick, apparently you have a dot files, your dot files are all in Git. And you want, or the idea is probably to be able to share them across different machines and use them in different contexts. And and there's certain things that you don't want to commit to VCS, like, I don't know, secrets. For Nick, it was email addresses. And so what you can do is you can tell Git, hey, include this other Git config file. And Git is cool about it, and it will not complain, apparently, if that file doesn't exist. And so if you're on, say, your work computer, you can have your dot files there, and you can say, hey, include this other work-specific Git config, right? And in that Git config, you can define, what is it, like a user and email address, you know, GPG key, whatever you want to add in there. And so, yeah, I thought that was neat. Also, I think there's, oh, right. So you can, how does this work, Nick? So, okay, so the, how do you, so if you have a repo, say you're doing this on one machine and you have a working copy, and that's for your work, right? How do you say, okay, everything in here, is it like a per directory basis, or can you have like a parent directory and say, okay, everything under this parent directory needs to use this username and email? Is that what you do?
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's, so you mentioned there's that include, the ability to include another file. There's also a variation of that called include if. Okay. And in there, you can give it a couple of different options, but one of them is include if, git dir, and you give it a partial path to where that Git directory might exist. And if whatever Git directory you're in matches that partial path in any way, so like for mine, I have like a work directory where all of the repos I've cloned are in that work directory, and it has, you know, a specific name. So I can just say include if git dir is the path to that work directory, and then anything in there will source that other Git config so that you can do other overrides in there that are very specific to like your work, for example.
Right. That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. And if you didn't care about like putting your username and email in VCS, I mean, it seems like you could just use include if in your main Git config too, if you didn't want this like extra file that wasn't under version control. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Where did you learn that, Nick?
Spelunking through the Git docs on the internet.
Yeah, there's gold in there. There's
yes.
like, there are cool things that Git does in config files that you probably have no idea about. And I find new things all the time.
Yeah. The really cool part of that is that if those files don't exist, Git doesn't complain at you. It just ignores them quietly, which is what it should do.
Well, that's what I learned.
Very cool. All right. We will be right back. And hopefully that will be cut. That be right back part. Yeah, so break. Cool. That was a good segment, right around the same length as the first one. So we're
nice.
I have 6 minutes.
Okay. Let's
Should we
jump
just
right.
dive in?
Yeah.
Let's dive in and have Chris go first.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Cool. Let's do it. All right, we are back, and in this segment, we're going to give some shout outs or talk about stories of the week, very interesting things that are happening recently. So a little bit different from today. I learned these are interesting things that we plan to learn or that have happened in the community, in the news, or just shout outs to some really cool people or projects that we've seen. So starting us off, Chris, do you want to go first?
Yes, I do. So I wanted to shout out to one of the maintainers of Mocha, and he has been a maintainer for, I don't know, several years now, Peter Mueller. He is Munter, M-U-N-T-E-R, on GitHub. And so what Peter did recently was he basically tore out our build toolchain. So our build toolchain has been browserify for a very long time. And so Mocha kind of has these two areas of the code base, and they're not split out as well as they should be. But we have one area which runs in Node, and it only runs in Node. And in there, since we support Node 10 or newer, we can use all the cool syntax. And then we have this other area, which is, okay, this code gets shipped to a browser. And so in here, we have to use essentially code that runs in IE11. And we have historically not run any transpilers or anything. Anyway, this is just terrible, and it's like not fun, because we have an ESLint file that has essentially this big list of files that you can use modern syntax on, and everything else you can't. And so, you know, you don't necessarily know, as I said, it's not well divided or organized, but you don't necessarily know from any given file whether or not you can use, I don't know, the class keyword, right? So what he did is he pulled out Browserify, and he moved us over to Rollup, and you know, there's Babel and all sorts of other, well, not all sorts of other things, but those are the main ones, right? So we can now use these modern syntax across the entire Mocha code base, which is a relief, really. It's you know, it's just it's painful not to be able to use those things, and so I just wanted to thank you, Peter, for your effort and getting that landed. It is awesome, and thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. Divya, you want to go next?
Yeah. So my shout outs are thematic. So I've been, as I mentioned, writing a lot of TypeScript and Rust. And for me, what has been really useful is using the playgrounds for either. So TypeScript has I think it's called it's a playground, TypeScript playground. And then Rust has a very similar one as well, which allows you to just like write some code and then compile it, and it gives you like really good error messaging, as well as like examples. I don't think the Rust one gives you examples, but the TypeScript one does. So if I don't know how to write something, let's say, there's a chance that the examples will show, like for instance, if I don't know how to write async await in TypeScript, there is an example for it that I can automatically load into the playground. And that has been phenomenal for me because I don't have to look at the documentation, because I actually really dislike TypeScript docs. I think they're very difficult to read. And I think in general, whenever people document using the TypeScript docs, it's very, like, it gives me a sense of what types something takes, but not how to use the thing, which is really annoying. And so I think the playground has been really useful in terms of ramping up really quickly when I need to get a question answered, so I don't have to read the docs. I can just like automatically load an example or try to figure out how to type it and then get TypeScript to yell at me within the playground itself. So like I don't have to do that within my project itself. I can just do this in this independent playground. And same for Rust. I can just write some Rust code in an independent playground without having to set up a configuration environment or like run my entire Rust project to see if one thing worked. And so honestly, there's a huge shout out to people who write playgrounds. I believe the Rust one is written by the Integer 32 team. There's probably someone specifically there that I'm forgetting, but that is phenomenal, and I think really useful for my learning with that. I have no idea who wrote the TypeScript playground, but it's great. And I actually like the current version of the playground, not the future version. I think there's a V3 of it. I really dislike the V3. It's very unclear and confusing. And I find the V2 one, which is the current version one, way clearer personally. But regardless, the people who write playgrounds are great because it's a really great way to get people to like get comfortable with it. I think similar on that vein is like when Sass was first introduced, there's like a try Sass. So you can write like Sass functions and variables and then get that to compile to CSS. So it's a really quick way of like just prototyping without having to like read docs. So yeah, that's my shout out.
That's really cool. Yeah, I will agree with you on that. I've been mostly using the V2 playground, but the one thing that I really do like in V3, and it's an experimental feature, is it will show you the AST of whatever you type in
Oh,
there.
right. That's true. Yeah, that is nice.
Yeah, but yeah, definitely some cool work. I also love that it's just so shareable with these playgrounds. Like you can type some code and then
Yes,
share it.
that's true. Yes, actually, I forgot that. That's a very nice feature too, because then I can easily just be like, I'm struggling with this, and then someone can send me a TypeScript playground and show me how to write the thing. So nice.
Cool. I will go next, and the cool thing that I wanted to shout out is something that Zach Leatherman has been working on, and it's called Speedlify, and it's a pretty cool way to continuously measure performance, specifically of static sites, and it's got a full dashboard that is running on Netlify that shows the performance over time of different static sites. Using 11D or Nuxt or Next or other tools like that, and it'll show you every time it runs and how those have changed, and it has a graph that shows exactly what's changed. It'll give their Lighthouse scores, and you can break down. I believe you can break down into specific pages to see how those are performing, which is really cool. So yeah, I'll throw a link to that in the show notes. And KBall, what do you got?
Yeah, so I have two different things that I want to shout out. They're both pretty small, or stories that I saw that I thought were neat. The first one is there was a new release of Chrome DevTools that adds support for editing, or better support for editing styles created with the CSS object model APIs, which essentially means any sort of CSS and JS framework that you're using, many of them are now using those object model, and they were previously uneditable in DevTools, which meant that one of the key tooling that you had for visibility into and changing of your styles was not available in a CSS and JS world. And I'm still not a huge fan of CSS and JS for many use cases, but it is a critical tool for some use cases, particularly large teams and distributed teams, large products. And it's also something that at least a lot of the React world is moving towards. So I think we've got to have good support for it. And I just love to see that tooling support coming along for it. I am grudgingly using styled components in my stuff at work right now, and even mostly getting used to it, but still not a fan. Anyway, the other thing I want to shout out is in one of the breaks, after we talked about Vue and all this stuff I went and clicked in on a Vue newsletter on the Vue.js News, and I saw some stuff, PR posted in the RFCs by Evan Yu about single file component improvements. And the thing I want to shout out about it that I think is really cool is it's doing essentially a set of compile time, sugar, and changes for cleaning up how you do things, inspired by Svelte. And
nice.
Longtime listeners will know that I'm a big proponent of moving more and more things in our front-end ecosystem to compile time and trying to pre-compile them. That's, in my mind, what Jamstack is all about. That's what enables edge computing. It's a huge thing, and I love to see this kind of cross-pollination of innovation in that space happening between frameworks, because that's something that I think Svelte has really pushed the bar on and made some dramatic improvements, and I'm excited to see where it goes, and as it goes into other frameworks, becomes Vueified for Vue. Maybe React will pick up some interesting tips, and how that innovation continues to roll.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, that is what we have for the party this week. Thank you so much to our panelists, KBall, Divya, and Chris, and we will see you next week. Party on.
Yay.
Immediately regretted saying party on.
All right, I'm going to stop recording and export.
Same, me too.
Yep. And I'm going to turn off the broadcast. So thank you, live listeners. We will see you next week.
And what episode are we on?
Oh, I meant to go look that up.